All right, welcome guys. Thomas here. Monday, or no, not Monday, it's Tuesday actually today, because we had some Easter celebration. That's the way the cookie crumbles sometimes, even during the boot camp. We have to take a break now and then to live our lives. But here we are back at it, week 4 of the boot camp, web-based applications. We're bumping up the complexity a little bit more, and look into the fantastic world of building software that will be run on the network, distributed according to a model that is called software as a service. We will get into that more in detail later on. This is just an orientation of what the week will look like, and a little introduction to the challenge, to one of the first challenges. Just to get you started. Again, we are a little short on time, and therefore we need to make use of every hour that is to our disposal. So week 4, let's get at it. Now, as you guys know, I usually include a quote in my presentations, and this one is a bit long. It's about legacy code written. It's a quote from a guy called Michael Feathers, and he wrote a fantastic book called Working Effectively with Legacy Code. It is considered like a Bible, but that's a bit of blasphemy, of course. But it's the go-to book when you work with legacy code. And he said something like this: legacy code, the phrase strikes disgust in the hearts of programmers. It conjures images of slogging through a murky swamp of tangled undergrowth with leeches beneath and stinging flies above. It conjures odors of murk, slime, stagnancy, and offal. Although your first joint of programming might have been intense, the misery of dealing with legacy code is often sufficient to extinguish that flame. So this is what you guys are about to face. If we haven't yet killed your enthusiasm toward programming, this week might be the week where we succeed with that. If you survive this week and you're still interested in software development and building for the web, then you can start to call yourself true programmers, because you have endured hell. I wanted to throw this at you because this is going to be hard. A, you guys are learning to program and code, and B, we're gonna throw one of the most challenging things at you, and that is dealing with legacy code. And this is a true feeling that this is a true quote from this book, and this is something that a lot of developers feel, and we feel that it's better to start early and learn about this, overcome this obstacle and this fear, make you go through hell, and see if you can come up on the other side. Again, in order to succeed, you have to stay on top of your mental game, as well as everything you've learned during the camp so far. Yes. Right. So think about that when we move forward. This week, we will be taking our first steps in the land of Ruby on Rails, which is a full stack web application framework. And working with legacy code base serves several purposes, as everything else that we do here at the Craft Academy Bootcamp. We want you to learn about the anatomy of a web-based application, which is slightly different than any other apps that you can encounter. We want you to learn, of course, about testing web applications, and learn about, in practice, more reading and understanding code, of course. We have an extensive learning objective slide here, a lot of things. And I actually shortened it a little bit. I think it's even more extensive in your course materials. And really, guys, I really need you to study this in your course material and get back to this during the week. Our materials are not just text that you can read once or skim over and then forget about it. It's a living document that you need to go back to. And for instance, those learning objectives that we talk about in the beginning of each week, you kind of need to go back to that during your work, during the week, but also at the end of the week when you sit down to reflect a little bit, because these are a little bit like checkboxes, and you have to always bear in mind those 4 stages of learning with the unconscious incompetence and moving forward. And this week we want you to learn about Ruby on Rails, of course, which is the framework we're going to use. But the framework is just a tool. Remember that. The concepts are more important. And here, of course, the model view controller pattern comes into play. That's really, really imperative and important for you guys to dive in, to try to internalize, both in terms of theory, but also in practice. We're going to talk more about that later on. We want you to learn how to work with legacy code, learn about best practices, dry, convention over configuration, etc. Dry stands for do not repeat yourself, as in compared to wet, write everything twice. We like those acronyms in this world. We want you to learn how to identify what libraries, external packages that are called gems in the land of Ruby. Which of these gems provide a lot of functionality and how to read and use documentation properly. Instead of reverting just, let's Stack Overflow everything, a lot of answers are actually in the documentation for every gem, for every library that we use. That's really important. I think some of you already have stumbled upon that during the camp. We want you, of course, to see the light in terms of how tests can help us drive the development process. You won't necessarily do it yet because it's fairly early. Some people, see or embrace the BDD or TDD way at the end of the camp, but hopefully some of you will become converts early on and see the benefits of working with in a test-driven way. But we also want you to practice team collaboration and all the agile stuff that we've spoken about and kind of practiced at least parts of. Now we want to put this together and have you work on a small project and take your first baby steps in agile planning and assigning tasks. And of course, we want you to stay on top of your Git game and use the Git flow in a broader setting, in a team setting, where you will collaborate and swap code and then take ownership of code bases together. You practice some basic flows like Git Pong, etc. Now it's gonna involve up to 4 people, or perhaps even the coaches, so 5 or 6 people in your own flow, and that's gonna be quite demanding. But it's you can master it if you just pay attention to details and practice everything in a slow pace. Right. So building web applications. That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna start with that in the beginning of the week. We're gonna jump right into a flow that will allow us to set up the environment and configure a Rails application so that we can start developing features. And what are the challenges? Yes, the challenges for this week. The AUT challenge. AUT stands for Acceptance Unit Test Cycle. It's an individual challenge. It says here it's pair programming, but it's not. It's an individual challenge. I will change that before I distribute this in PDF format to you. It's going to be a challenge that is fairly short. It's that it needs to be completed by the end of the day today or tonight. It's fairly simple, and it's about basic configuration and testing of a very simple feature, but that will span over the entire stack with Vue, the logic, but also persistence in database. And you will see the power of the Rails framework, how fast you can develop certain things. Then we're going to jump into the legacy code challenge, and that is a group challenge. It will be divided into 2 teams. It's going to be 3 days plus the weekend, and that's the challenge where you guys will practice working with legacy code and your first steps in Agile. It's going to be quite a ride. It's going to take you from your local host to the internet. And we are going to introduce a new set of tools. There's a lot of tools going on that needs to be in your tool belt or tool chain as a developer. Of course, Rails as a framework, we're going to We're going to dive deep into that. We're going to start using Heroku, is an infrastructure as a service provider that allows us to push out our applications to the internet on virtual servers. We've already used Netlify before. We're going to use another one this week. We're going to use Semaphore. Not sure if you used that service before. It's software as a service. It's a software as a service for continuous integration. Jesus, there's so many buzzwords floating around. Sorry about that, guys. So that will help us to run our tests and make sure that code that has been proposed for merge is actually working before we make a decision on merging it. It taps well into the flow that we are using on GitHub, but also on deployment to Heroku. We're gonna take a closer look at that. And of course, the fourth logo is the logo of rubygems.org. It's a repository of libraries that you can use in your development process to pull in some functionality to your applications, very much like NPM, which is a package manager. So rubygems.org and the piece of software that we use that is called Bundler works well together. That helps us to pull in libraries. There will probably be some more tools that we're gonna employ this week, but these are the four main areas where you have to do a little bit of research and work with on a daily basis. So, as I mentioned, we will deploy our application to Heroku, and Heroku is an infrastructure as a service provider that helps us work with continuous integration and continuous deployment. That it's a quite powerful combo that will simplify our lives. We need to adhere to the agile principle of pushing out our application as soon as possible, so that we can verify that we're on a good track. And again, it doesn't really matter if it works on your local host; it needs to work on a deployed server. So because working software is the primary measurement of progress, as we've already said so many times. So I think that's about it. Let's have a productive week. Let's get smarter. That's the main goal here. And the second part of this talk will be about some practical things that we need you to do. So let's see. Let me just jump over to our class materials. And if you go to week 4, Ruby on Rails, there is a section. It should be released to all of you, and please acknowledge if it is, or at least tell me if it isn't. Where we introduce you to the acceptance unit cycle. I will do we will have a discussion. I want you to read through this materials. We will have a discussion after 11 when I start my demonstrations on how to work with this with the setting. What I will focus on now for the next 10 minutes is to make sure that we together go through the setup. So basically, I will do it now. You will watch me do it, and that will help you understand the instructions in the course materials better if you have seen me do it at least once, right? At least that's the theory here. So let's just dive into this as soon as possible. Let's just pull up my terminal, and I need you to acknowledge. Can you see my terminal properly?
Yes.
That's fantastic. All right, so let's just move this out of the way. Let's see, there we go. And I can also close the presentation. I don't need it for now. Like this. Fantastic. Okay, so I'm going to create a new, no, I will not create a new folder. Let's see. So Rails is a gem. You will get a deeper dive or presentation of Rails as a framework from Faraz. I think we have that talk scheduled at some point. Rails is a gem, so it needs to be installed on your computer, and you install that with as you install any other gem, with a terminal command saying gem install Rails, like this. I already have Rails installed, so I don't have to run it. But this is the way you install Rails on your machine. Now, there is a command that you will acquaint yourself with and you use quite often during the bootcamp, and that is the Rails new command. And that is a command that initiates a new Rails application for you. Now, before we hit enter on this one, we need to pass in some configuration. For instance, we need to give this application a name. So we name those applications using snake case. So in this case, I will call this Rails demo April, but you can call it whatever you want. I will show you how that name is being used later. It's being used to create the folder where the application will be, but also internally inside of the application. So you don't want to make any typos here. You don't want to change that name later. You can change it, but I would advise against you when you're beginners and so on. So just pay attention to details so you don't make any mistakes here. We want to pass in a flag called database equals PostgreSQL. PostgreSQL, yes, and we want to say skip test, and we want to skip bundle. Now, when we say skip test, it doesn't mean that we want to skip testing altogether. What we want to do is to avoid having Rails install a basic testing framework that is called Minitest. In our application, we instead want to use Rspec. We're going to configure it later. And skip bundle means that we don't want Rails to run bundle install for us immediately, because we will be adding some gems and so on to the setup before we actually want to reach out to rubygems.org to fetch every dependency. For now, this is it. Rails new, Rails demo April. We want to use PostgreSQL as database. We want to skip test and skip bundle. I'm ready to hit enter. Let's do it. And now that will generate a few files for us. Quite a few, actually. It's the entire application structure with a README, with everything, So I can cd into this repository. Rails already created or initiated a Git repo for us, so be mindful of that. Do not mess this one up. It means that you need to manually have to create a repository on your Git account or GitHub account and connect it to this local repo. Be mindful of that. So I can do git status, and we can see that there's a lot of things going on. The git ignore file is pretty good for us, so we can feel very secure in saying git add this and git CI. Well, in my case, CI, because it stands for commit. New Rails app. Something like that. Okay, so I'm gonna pop this open in code and get over here. Here is my Rails application. Again, we will do a more extensive talk about all the moving parts in all these folders, because there's a lot of folders going on. What I want to do now is, of course, I would probably connect my GitHub repository to this folder. You guys I can leave that out from the demonstration. What I need to do is to go into my my gem file, which is, of course, the place where we store all our dependencies. You guys been working with Ruby before, so you recognize the gem file. Now, this time around, it's much more extensive. It comes with a lot of comments, I would encourage you to read through those comments and then delete them because we don't need them in place for anything at the moment. Now, I will delete some of these gems, and so I want you to pay close attention to what I'm going to do. The first thing I'm doing is to remove all the comments that I don't need, that I don't find interesting. I want to clear everything in this group, development and test, even remove the bybag gem. I want to clear comments here, and I want to remove the last one about the TZ info data that is simply not useful to us at all. So it looks much cleaner now. We can clean this up even more, and this one is really important. We want to remove the SAS Rails gem. We don't need it for anything. We definitely want to remove the Coffee Rails gem. We don't need it for anything. We want to remove the JBuilder gem. We will not need it for anything, not initially at least. Now, what we do want to do is to add a few other gems, and that's going to be our testing framework, the first testing framework that we're going to install, and that will be Rspec. For that, we need to install Rspec Rails, which is a version of Rspec that is configured to be run with Ruby on Rails. I want us to install another gem called FactoryBot, and FactoryBot. Oh, it's factory_bot_rails. It's a version of a gem called FactoryBot that is specifically useful with Rails, and that will produce test doubles for us, test double data for us. We'll go into that more in detail later on. For now, just install it. And we're gonna install another gem called Shoulda Matchers. And that gem will help us to test our code in an easier way. It really makes our life much easier. You will see that later on. For now, let's just install it. Now we removed bybag, which is that's a debugger for Rails applications, but we want to install pry. You've used pry before. Now we want to install two gems, one called pry bybag and one called pry Rails. And the reason why we install both of them is because they overlap each other in functionality. It will make our life much easier when we want to debug our applications. For now, that will be enough, and this step needs to be finished with running bundle install in our terminal, because now we actually want to reach out to rubygems.org and fetch all of these dependencies. Yes, I did misspell Shoulda Matchers. It's a dash rather than underscore. Let's run it again. And now we're getting everything from our source, and the source is rubygems.org. And while this is running, let's just jump over to rubysource.org to have a quick look on that website. I bet you haven't been there yet, so let's go there. So rubysource.org is like npmjs.org. It's a website where you can read about all the dependencies, all the libraries that are available to us in the Rails domain. And so, for instance, we can take a look at the pry bybag. And we can see here that it has been downloaded 31 million times or 32 million times. It combines pry with bybag, adds step, next, finish, continue, and break. It's in release 3.7.0. We can read a little bit more about this here when different releases have been actually put in production, and we have some links here to the homepage, source code, etc., right? So you can find useful information here on rubygems.org. You can also get instructions on how to install this gem, either with a terminal command or what you need to add to your gem file. You can copy these links and just paste them into your gem file should you want to do that manually, and so on. So I would encourage you guys to use rubygems.org to read up on the gems that you are gonna use in your applications. Now, we installed all the dependencies. Now, I had most of them already installed on my computer. Some of them I did not have installed, and these are marked in green here. As you can see, there are many gems that was being installed for me. If we jump over to our code base and go to the gem file log file, we can also see that this file is quite extensive, quite big, very similar to the JSON log file or yarn log when you use the JavaScript before. Do not touch this file. You can just glance over it. There's a lot of dependencies that has been added to our application, and we haven't started coding yet, right? So it's quite extensive. Now, what do we need to do as a next step? Well, we did add the Rspec library. So we've already started to configure our application to use tests in our flow. What I need to do now is to make sure that Rspec is being properly configured. So I'm gonna issue a command that it says Rails generate Rspec install. Right? And that will initiate Rspec in our application. It will run an installer for us and create a few files that might be or might not be familiar to you. A .rspec file, you had that originally when you started to work with Rspec and Ruby. A spec folder and a spec helper, but now there's a new file called Rails helper as well. Not only spec helper, but also Rails helper. And so why do we have two helper files? Well, because we will test or use Rspec to test some Ruby code, and that configuration is created in or made for us in the spec helper. But then there are some specific Railsy things that Rspec need to know about your environment. And those are set in the Rails helper. Let's have a look at that. So we have a spec folder, a new spec folder. We have the spec helper, a lot of comments. If you remember your first encounter with Ruby, you had that as well. We can safely remove all of these comments to make this a little more readable. I would of course encourage you guys to read through all of these comments because they do contain valuable information. However, we will use Rspec as it comes out of the box without making too many modifications, and therefore we can safely remove those comments. And as you see, the file is not that super big in any way. It only contains some setup. I will not go over everything here at this time, but we want to jump over to the Rails helper. And get rid of some comments here. And the important part is, again, attention to details, guys. Do not stress this. Make sure that you are careful when you remove those comments, so that you do not remove too much. We don't want to have support calls. Oh, I accidentally deleted everything. Try not to do that. And you can see here that the setup is pretty straightforward. Now, what we want to do now is to make use of the should matchers configuration, and we're going to add a little bit of code here. And that's going to be should matchers configure, pretty much just configure do, and that's we're gonna pass in a new block here, config and we're going to tell shootamatchers, which is also a gem, so you can read up about it on rubygems.org, that we're gonna integrate this library with Rails and Rspec. So we're just going to say integrate and do, and going to pop do, and we're going to say with, and I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to say with test framework. The test framework will be Rspec, and library. And the library will be Rails. We just tell this gem to be that we want to use it with Rails and library, because shootamatchers can be used with other frameworks as well. Now, another thing that we want to do is to jump over into the config folder, and in that folder there is a file called application RB. And even here, we would like to remove some comments. That's perfectly fine. We don't want to remove too much. Now we want to comment this one out. Actually, we don't want to remove it. And here, we're just gonna disable some generators that are provided for us by the framework. Now, you haven't seen the generators concept yet in action, but Rails comes with a lot of helper methods that will allow us to scaffold some code when we develop, so we don't have to write that code ourselves. But sometimes I feel that Rails is a little too generous. It generates way too many files for us. So we've came up with this setting where we can remove some of or disable some of the generators. This code is available to you in your course documentation. So you can feel free to copy and paste this. But what we basically do here is that we turn off some stuff that Rails will create for us automatically when we create some code. Now, if we just take a close look at line 15 here, you see that the module that we are dealing with in the application RB is called Rails Demo April in Pascal case. Now, this corresponds well to the application name that I gave or passed into the Rails new command. If you remember correctly, I used that in Snake case, but Rails used that to set the name of the entire application to Rails Demo April. Now, one last thing that I want to do just to make sure that we're on track is to check the .rspec file. And here, it's really important that I change this from require spec helper to require Rails helper. And I also want to say tag and format documentation like this. And that's about it. I will go over to my terminal, and I'm going to try if this one works. So there are two things I'm going to try out. First, I'm going to see if Rspec is properly configured. So I'm going to say Rspec. And it failed because there is no database that is configured. Now, you might wonder, why would he not need a database? He doesn't have any data to store in it. Well, the application requires you to have a database, so we're going to have to create one. And we do that with a very simple task that is goes like this: Rails DB create. And we did that. So now we can rerun our rspec command. And it says 0 examples, 0 failures. Well, that's, of course, the way it should be, because we haven't written any tests yet, right? But since there are no errors popping up, it means that everything is up and running. The last thing we will do is to create or fire up the server, the local server, and we do that by issuing the Rails server command. And my dear friends, we will open up a new browser window, and we're going to go to localhost 3000, and you will see this, hopefully. Yay, you are on Rails. There is another section where we set up Cucumber, which is the testing framework that we will use to work with our acceptance tests. This is a challenge that will test your ability to read documentation and adhere to instructions and follow them. And if you get this far, then we will be able to start tracking at the first acceptance and unit tests in the next step. Thank you, guys.